This video contains opinions, as in my opinions. If you happen to think differently about the subject or subjects of this video, that's fine, you know, to each their own. I love Crash Bandicoot. That's not to say that his games are the greatest I've played, or that I have bestial homoerotic lust towards an anthropomorphic orange cartoon marsupial, no sir. Crash is to me what Mario is to most people who grew up with a Nintendo console. The original was the first game I ever played, and along with its sequels are my ultimate nostalgic callbacks that I can play over and over without getting tired of them. I remember all the secrets, I know the levels inside and out, I can hum along to any piece of music in the soundtracks, I know my Crash. Since I recently finished playing through the original trilogy again on my shiny new PS3, I figured I'd delve into a little retrospective of one of my favourite series of all time. Hopefully with less nostalgia involved, but I make no guarantees. Crash Bandicoot. The original was made for the PlayStation 1 back in 1996 by Naughty Dog, who are more well known these days for having made the Uncharted trilogy and The Last of Us. It had a pretty fun style of gameplay, gorgeous visuals, and was Naughty Dog's attempt at creating a mascot for the PlayStation akin to Nintendo's Mario and Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog. To no avail, unfortunately. The PlayStation never really had a mascot, but a few of the platform's characters are still fondly remembered as pseudo-mascots, like Spyro, Abe, Daniel Fortescue, Parappa the Rapper, Croc, and arguably Lara Croft. When you get right down to it, Crash 1 wasn't really a groundbreaking game. The story was about a genetically altered Bandicoot named Crash. His goal was to save his girlfriend Tawna, essentially Pamela Anderson but for furries, from the evil Dr. Neo Cortex and his henchmen. The gameplay, while fun, still had its problems. The movement was clunky, the bosses were easy and mostly uninteresting, a lot of level completion relied on backtracking after getting certain gems, the means to get gems was frustratingly difficult for most of the levels, and the save system was a massive pile of shit. You could only save if you completed bonus rounds that show up every few levels, or by earning gems. Also, it was early PS1, so there was even password saves for the poor people who couldn't afford memory cards at the time. That was an objective look at it anyway, because from a nostalgic standpoint, none of these nitpicks bugged me. Anyway, a year later in 1997, Crash Bandicoot 2 Cortex Strikes Back was released, and it was awesome. It controlled better, it introduced crouching, crawling, sliding and belly flops to Crash's repertoire, progression was a little less linear, you could break every box in a level to earn the gem without also having to avoid dying, the soundtrack was greatly improved over the minimalist midis from the original, and you could actually save anytime you wanted between levels. This is everything a sequel should be. It's faithful to the original but with new additions, and it's not afraid to fix the crap that didn't work. Well, mostly. A big sticking point though, the bosses still weren't that great. Don't get me wrong, a few have some pretty decent design to them, but they're just too easy. Worst of all is the final battle with Cortex. The whole game builds up that Cortex was deceiving you to collect crystals for his Cortex Vortex so that he can brainwash humanity to be his slaves. And how do you deal with him in the final showdown? Chase him through an asteroid field and spin him 3 times. No really, that's it. If you manage to get the hang of the awful jetpack controls from 2 previous levels, all you have to do is chase Cortex and hit him enough times before he can reach the blue portal at the end, which presumably leads to the Cortex Vortex. He doesn't even attack you. The only hazards in the way are asteroids and mines, and they don't hurt you, they only slow you down. The only way to die is if Cortex reaches the end, and it isn't even shown what kills Crash, it just blacks out. They even composed an awesome remix of Cortex's theme from the first game, and this is what it went into. And before anyone brings it up, yeah, I probably am making too big a deal of something that's been around for 16 years. Anyway, in 1998, otherwise known as the best year for games ever, Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped was released. The biggest difference this time is that the levels take place in different time periods instead of the 3 islands from the last 2 games. It took the established gameplay from Crash 2 and added even more stuff. You earn power-ups every time you beat a boss for the first time, the bosses were actually more challenging, and there was more variety to the gameplay with vehicles, a tiger cub, a little dinosaur, and underwater levels. It also introduced relics. Relics came in Sapphire, Gold, and Platinum, that were rewarded to you depending on how fast you could finish a level. It was a pretty good way to encourage replayability, because some of the levels will require a lot of retries if you want to get the Platinums, or even some Golds. From a gameplay standpoint, this is definitely my favourite Crash game. The power-ups were always put to good use, the bosses were pretty fun, and I loved the relic challenges. The only thing I could think of that I didn't like was the underwater levels, because, well, I have yet to play an underwater level in a game that I didn't hate, with the possible exception of Aquaria Towers from Spyro 2. Another year later, in 1999, Crash Team Racing was released. It was the first spin-off in the series, and the final Crash game developed by Naughty Dog. It was basically Mario Kart with a Crash Bandicoot twist to it, because there were a lot of kart racing games released around this time. Granted, I never played most of them, but CTR was pretty good. Now, I'm not going to put up comparisons between this and Mario Kart, because aside from playing Mario Kart DS for about 10 minutes, I haven't really played any of the Mario Kart games. CTR was a pretty solid game though. There was plenty to do, it had its own version of relic races, and it's one of the rare cases of a game where I actually enjoy the multiplayer. Racing was mostly pretty one-sided with most of the people I faced, but battle mode was an absolute joy. I thought the whole racing spin-off thing would be a Naughty Dog tradition for a while. They ended Crash with CTR, they ended Jak and Daxter with Jak X, but they didn't do one for Uncharted. It could have worked. They could have called it Uncarted. Oh come on, I had to. Unfortunately, this was Naughty Dog's swan song for the Crash Bandicoot series, because their contract with Universal Interactive Studios had come to an end. Universal acquired the rights to Crash, and Naughty Dog went off to work on the Jak and Daxter series for the PS2. I'll do a retrospective of those games at some point too. I still have to get around to finishing my copy of the HD collection. Quite a few Crash games were made after this, moving between different developers over the years. Because of how many there are, I'll only go into greater detail for a few. Crash Bash, released in 2000 by Eurocom Entertainment Software. It was basically a Mario Party clone with Crash characters and wasn't really that great. Crash Bandicoot, The Wrath of Cortex, released in 2001 by Traveller's Tales. When I first got my PS2, the two games I got for it were the first Jak and Daxter and this. It was rather poetic. The next game by the company that made some of my favourite games, and the next game in a series formerly owned by that developer. Overall, Wrath of Cortex wasn't bad, however it also wasn't that good. Most of the formula was a less well-executed version of the gameplay from Crash 3. Sure, there were some different powers, lots of vehicles, Super Monkey Ball style levels, and better branched out gameplay for Coco. But it didn't help overshadow the feeling that it was something I'd played plenty of times before. Plus, the PS2 version had some pretty atrocious loading times. Crash Nitro Kart, released in 2003 by Vicarious Visions. This one was just sad. Sure, it wasn't awful, but it did the same thing as Wrath of Cortex. It took the formula from another game from the series, in this case Crash Team Racing, and basically remade it, but in a way that just wasn't as good. The track layouts were visually confusing, the karts had almost no sense of speed, and the cutscenes were embarrassingly written and acted. The only thing I really liked about it was the title screen music. Crash to Insanity, released in 2004 by a different branch of Traveller's Tales. And just to break up the flow of depression I've had going here, I loved Twinsanity. If you just looked at the cover and box blurb for the game, it doesn't really do itself justice. But really, it was great. This was around the point that the series became less serious and took on a more comedic approach. And you know what? It works. Clancy Brown didn't reprise his role as Cortex from this game onwards, but Lex Lang is great for the more comedic version of the character.
And so I've organized a little gathering, like a birthday party, except the exact opposite. Coming through! Ladies? Excuse me, madam. Are those real? Mother?
Also, I have to say, this game has my favourite version of Crash's visual design. I like how he's completely silent as well. All his antics are portrayed through his body language, and it works really well. Gameplay-wise, it's a lot more open world now. The core levels may be linear, but going between levels to replay them again requires you to do some travelling. There are no longer warp rooms either. In each level there are 6 different coloured gems hidden that unlock extras like cutscenes and concept art. Crystals are still involved, but they don't really serve any purpose other than being a minor plot device. Also, the soundtrack is done by a cappella group Spiral Mouth, so it sounds a lot different to earlier games in the series. They range from amusing to annoying to plain awesome, but it's really a love it or hate it thing. As for me, I love the soundtrack. Now granted, this game certainly has its problems. It was rushed out, and it shows. There are plenty of glitches that can either be humorous or hazardous, certain gameplay and plot elements were never fully realised, the animation in non-FMV cutscenes is usually incredibly stiff and simple, and some platforming sections involving floating boxes are annoying and imprecise. But yeah, issues aside, I quite enjoyed it. Crash Tag Team Racing, released in 2005 by Radical Entertainment. Despite what the title may lead you to believe, this wasn't another attempt at making Crash Team Racing like Nitro Kart. The racing itself in this game isn't even that great, really. The open world exploration is alright, but the level design can get a bit confusing at times. The game still continues Twinsanity's direction of making the series comedic, but I don't like what they did with Crash here. I mentioned that I like how Crash was silent in Twinsanity and all his comedy was in his body language, but someone at Radical seemed to think otherwise. Crash doesn't talk, instead he makes all sorts of annoying babbling and cheers provided by Jess Harnell. It becomes incredibly grating after a while. CTTR overall isn't really that bad, but it's certainly forgettable. Almost done. Radical were at the helm for the next Crash game again, so what do they have in store for us this time? Oh god, let's just get this over with. Crash of the Titans. See what they did there? Released in 2007 by Radical. The game took quite a different turn from traditional Crash gameplay, and so did the character design. Okay, seriously, I'm still not past this yet. Why? What did we do to deserve this? Why does Crash look like a furry surfer dude? What happened to Crunch's buffness? Why does Coco have a melon for a head? Is Aku Aku the spirit of a gorilla? Since when did Uka Uka become an Australian hat? Do I even have to mention what they did to Tiny? And I never really cared much for Nina, but I think everyone preferred it when she didn't talk. Okay, character design gripes aside, how was the actual game? It's alright, I guess. It can get a bit repetitive at times, but it's alright. It's pretty much the standard brawler gameplay of light attack, heavy attack, special attack, bam that so many action games have these days. There's also the titular titans, which are basically genetically altered superpowered animals, and fusions of different creatures. You can weaken them and take control of them to more efficiently take out foes, but really that's all there is to the game. Standard brawler button mashing combat, a half-baked story with a few funny moments, and a soundtrack that's about as forgettable as the rest of the game. In 2008, we saw the release of Crash Mind Over Mutant, the sequel to Titans and the last Crash game made aside from a few mobile titles. Was this the swan song to the beloved Bandicoot? Well, no. Mind Over Mutant was basically Titans again, but with a few side-scrolling sections and a lot of backtracking. I quite like the cutscenes though. Each one was presented in a different art style. One may look kinda like gritty western comics, and another may look kinda like South Park. Plus Brio, an often forgotten character from early in the series, makes his return. I will say this, of all the changes to characters made in Titans and Mind Over Mutant, I quite like Cortex and Brio, in both appearance and how they act. Brio even makes an amusing reference to his role in the original game. So yeah, Mind Over Mutant has that going for it. It's just too bad the game itself is rubbish. And that was my retrospective look on the career of everyone's favourite orange marsupial. Crash will always remain as one of my nostalgic callbacks to simpler days. His legacy may not be the most glamorous, but on the bright side, at least I didn't grow up with Sonic the Hedgehog.